One medieval family could lose dinner because a baker made the loaf too light. In a world without modern safety check, danger did not always arrive with swords, plague carts, or burning armies. Sometimes it came as a crooked scale, a sour cup of ale, a pig dragging filth through the market, a rotten fish on a wooden board, or one coal left glowing after dark. Many rules that sound ridiculous now were built around fears people felt in their stomachs, streets, roofs, and homes. Tonight, we step into the muddy markets, smoky rooms, narrow lanes, and anxious households where bizarre medieval rules began to make terrifying sense. Before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if these quiet journeys into the past are something you truly enjoy. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel while the world slowly falls asleep. Now, lower the lights. Let the room grow still. Turn on a fan if you like that soft background sound, and let yourself drift with me into tonight's strange corner of history. If one were to walk through a medieval town market in the morning, bread would be one of the first things to notice. Loaves sat on wooden boards, in baskets, or on rough cloths covered with flour, while buyers moved slowly between stalls with coins hidden in their palms. Some came from narrow rooms where the fire had already gone low, and some came from work yards with empty stomachs and mud on their shoes. Bread was not a small purchase, it was the day's weight. A poor woman might stand at the baker's stall counting the coins twice before handing them over. Behind her, a child might stare at the loaves while trying not to ask for food too soon. A labourer could buy one loaf and expect it to last through broth, ale, and the next morning's hunger. So if that loaf was lighter than promised, the loss would not stay in the market. It would follow them home. In many medieval towns, bakers could be watched, checked and punished if their bread was too light or dishonest. A loaf might be placed on a balance, compared with local grain prices, and judged in front of officials, neighbours, and other sellers. If it was too small, poorly made, or mixed with cheap materials in a deceitful way, the baker could be fined or publicly shamed. The rule sounds strange now, but the market understood why it existed. Bread carried trust. The baker's hands were covered in flour, but his life was not easy either. Grain costs money, fuel costs money, and ovens had to stay hot before the first customers arrived. If wheat prices rose after a bad harvest, he had to choose between losing profit, raising prices, or quietly making the loaves smaller, so little less dough in each loaf could help him survive. The poor paid for it. The buyer did not see the dough before baking. She did not know how much grain had gone into the mixture, how much water had stretched it, or whether the loaf had been shaped to look fuller than it really was. She could press the crust, lift it once in her hand, and hope the weight felt right. But hope was weak protection when the baker knew more than she did. A loaf could lie quietly. It did not need to look rotten or dangerous. It could sit beside the other loaves, pale with flour, warm at the edge, and ordinary enough to pass from hand to hand without suspicion. The missing weight was hidden inside something familiar. That made the cheating easier to miss. By the time the loaf reached a poor room, the loss became visible, so Mother might cut thinner slices and push the harder crust toward herself. A child might scrape crumbs from the table because the piece on his wooden plate was gone too quickly. A worker might wrap a smaller portion in cloth and carry it under his coat, knowing it would have to last until evening. Hunger counted what the scale had missed. There might be little else on the table. Thin broth could steam in a pot without much meat in it. An onion, a few beans, a heel of old cheese, or a cup of weak ale might make the bread seem like more than it was. So the loaf had been fairly weighed, the meal could stretch a little further. If not, silence would settle over the room. Sooner, that silence mattered. A medieval market was not a place where every customer had equal power. A wealthy household could send a servant to buy better bread or complain to the right person. So a poor buyer often had only a few coins, a tired body, and the need to return home before the day's work was lost. If cheated, she might not be able to buy again. The missing bread became part of the family's hunger. This is why officials sometimes stood near the stall with scales and rules. Scene was simple but tense. A loaf on the balance, a baker watching, a buyer waiting, and neighbours pretending not to stare too openly. Flour dust clung to the baker's sleeves while the official checked whether the bread matched what the town expected. One wrong weight could stain a man's name. Shame was useful, so a baker's reputation mattered, because he sold to the same people again and again. The woman with the cloth bag, the apprentice with dirty cuffs, the servant sent from a kitchen, and the old man buying a small loaf after church might all return the next week. They remembered which stall felt fair, and which loaves looked large but vanished too quickly at home. A fine cut once, but distrust could hurt every market day. The rule also helped keep anger from spreading. In a hungry town, food cheating was not just a private complaint. It could move from one buyer to another, from the stall to the alley, from the alley to the tavern, until people began saying that bakers were stealing from empty stomachs. A light loaf could become more than a bad trade. It could become a public insult. Medieval people did not need modern packaging to understand this. They did not have printed labels, factory weights, or neat supermarket shelves. They had hands, eyes, scales, memory, and the fear of being cheated when there was no money left to fix the mistake. The system was rough, but the worry was real. By evening, the market boards would be bare, crumbs would stick to the wood, and the baker's stall would look harmless again. Families would carry their loaves through narrow streets, past smoke, animals, damp walls, and doorways where other hungry people watched them pass. Some bread would be eaten with soup, some saved for work, and some divided so carefully that even crumbs were not wasted. The law followed the loaf all the way to the table. A light loaf was not a small mistake in a medieval town, because every missing piece could become hunger inside a poor family's room. But bread was only the first thing watched in the market, and ale could bring the same fear of cheating into barrels, cups, wet floors, and crowded doorways. A sour drink poured in front of neighbours could ruin a brewer's name before the whole street had finished staring. Ale was not a small pleasure in many medieval communities. Sat on tables beside bread, filled wooden cups after work, and sometimes gave people a safer, more familiar drink than water drawn from a questionable source. A weak cup, a sour barrel, or a dishonest price could touch almost every household in the street. People noticed when it was wrong. They noticed quickly. In many villages and towns, brewing was not always the work of large public houses or powerful merchants. Ale could be made in small rooms, back kitchens, yards, or modest houses, where steam, smoke, wet wood, and grain smells clung to the walls. Many small-scale brewers were women, especially those selling ale to neighbours as part of household income. Their work helped keep a poor home alive. That made the inspection personal. A woman who brewed ale might begin before the room had fully warmed. She could carry water, handle grain, stir the mash, tend the fire, and watch the liquid darken while children, servants, or neighbours moved in and out of the same space. The floor might be damp from spills, the air heavy with yeast and smoke, and the barrel pushed close to a wall where there was barely room to pass. Brewing was work done with tired arms and close attention. One mistake could follow her outside. The ale was too weak, too sour, dirty, badly measured, or sold at the wrong price. It could bring trouble. Someone might complain after paying good coins for a drink that tasted thin, sharp, or spoiled. A local official, ale taster, or community figure could be called to judge it, depending on the place and custom. The test could happen close enough for neighbours to watch. That was the cruel part. The shame was not hidden in a private office. A wooden cup could be lifted in front of people who knew her name, her husband, her children, her debts, and the condition of her doorway. Someone might smell the ale, taste it, look at the barrel, check the measure, or compare the price with what was allowed. A few people standing nearby could become a crowd without anyone formally inviting them. Medieval streets did not keep secrets well. The brewer had reason to. Grain was not cheap, fuel was not free, and a poor household could depend on the coins earned from a few successful batches. If the drink came out weak, she might lose customers. If it came out sour, she might lose her reputation. As people believed she had cheated them, she could lose both money and trust in the same morning. Trust mattered as much as taste. Ale passed through ordinary life in quiet ways. A labourer might drink it after carrying stone, hauling timber, or working in a muddy field. Servant might bring a cup into a kitchen where bread crusts and leftovers made a small meal. A poor man might spend coins on ale, because it gave warmth, calories, and relief after a hard day. If the drink was bad, the disappointment was not refined. It was immediate. A sour barrel could mean wasted grain, so a dirty barrel could mean sickness. A short measure could mean a customer had been cheated in a way he could feel with every swallow. In a neighbourhood where people counted coins carefully, even a little fraud could turn into anger. The brewer was not selling luxury. She was selling something people used in daily life. So the inspection was harsh because the product was public. Bad ale did not remain inside the brewer's house once it was poured. It moved into mouths, stomachs, workrooms, taverns, lanes, and evening gatherings. If it caused illness or cheated buyers, the harm spread beyond one doorway. That is why communities watched it. Still, this should not be turned into a simple story where every woman brewer was only a victim of oppression. Some were respected for good ale, steady measures, and honest dealing. Some were skilled, practical, and known by customers who returned because the drink was worth the coin. The problem was that the same public trust that helped a brewer survive could also destroy her when something went wrong. A poor household could feel that danger sharply. The coins from ale might pay for grain, firewood, rent, cloth, or a child's food. A bad judgment in public could mean fewer buyers the next week. Fewer buyers meant less bread on the table. The embarrassment at the barrel could become hunger at home. The room where ale was made did not separate neatly from family life. Smoke from the fire could cling to sleeves, wet grain could leave sour smells near the floor, and cups might be rinsed in water that had already been used too much. A brewer might wipe her hands on an apron, lift a lid from the barrel, and hope the smell rising from it was still acceptable. She knew that one wrong batch could invite judgment. Neighbours knew it too. The public watching made the rule feel severe. A person's livelihood could be tested by a sip, a smell, a complaint, or a measure poured under someone else's eyes. There might no need for shouting. A quiet look of disappointment from a few customers could do enough damage. For the buyer, however, the rule made sense. People needed some protection against watered ale, sour ale, filthy brewing, or unfair pricing. Not everyone could afford to waste money on a bad cup. A poor worker who paid for ale expected strength, not coloured water. So a family buying drinks for the table expected something safe enough to share. The wooden barrel became a kind of public promise. Inside it was grain, labour, fuel, time, and trust. Outside it stood the people who had paid for that promise and expected it to hold. When the ale failed, the failure did not stay liquid, so it became shameful. By the end of the day the wet floor might dry, the barrel might be pushed back, and the cup used for testing might be washed and placed aside. But the memory would remain with the people who watched. They would remember the smell, the sour taste, the official's face, and the brewer standing there while her work was judged. In a small community, that memory could last longer than the ale itself. Spad ale was not just a spoiled drink in a medieval community, because it could waste coins, damage trust, and shame the person who brewed it in front of neighbours. But the same streets that watched bread and ale also carried something far worse through daily life: waste dirty water, animal filth, and rotting scraps pushed too close to people's doors. In the next part, one careless bucket thrown into the street could leave an entire row of houses breathing the stink of someone else's filth. So medieval street could be narrow enough for neighbours to hear each other cough through the walls. Doors opened close to the road. Carts scraped past us, animals moved between people, and dirty water often had nowhere clean to go. Smell of smoke, damp straw, food scraps, manure, and old mud could settle in the same space where children played, and workers carried bread home. Living close together made every bad habit public. One bucket could affect everyone. Waste did not vanish just because someone threw it outside. So a pail of dirty water poured from a doorway could run into the street channel, splash onto shoes, soak into straw, or sit in a low patch until the smell grew stronger. Animal dung from horses, pigs, dogs, and cattle could mix with kitchen scraps and rainwater, turning the ground slick under wooden soles, so a person stepping out before dawn might feel the street before seeing it. The street had a memory. Some towns tried to control this mess with rules about where and when people could dump waste. Residents might be told not to throw rubbish, animal filth, spoiled food, dead animals, or dirty water into public ways without care. Some places, people could be warned, fined, or forced to clean the area in front of their homes. The rule sounds obvious now, but it mattered because there was no modern sewer system waiting beneath the stones. A poor household had little room for cleanliness, so a family might live in one cramped space where food, tools, bedding, smoke, and damp clothing all shared the same air. A bucket near the door might hold wash water, floor dirt, kitchen scraps, or worse until someone had time to carry it away. So when work began early and bodies were tired, the easiest choice was often the closest patch of street. That choice became someone else's problem. Neighbours had to breathe it. The pressure was not only about smell. Dirty water could block drainage channels, soften the ground, attract flies, and leave filth pressed into the path where people walked to market, church, or work. A woman carrying bread might lift her skirt to avoid a dark puddle near the wall. A child might run barefoot and come back with mud and waste between his toes. Servants sent to fetch water could return with the stink of the street clinging to her shoes. This was daily life, not comedy. Medieval people were not blind to filth. They did not understand germs in the modern way, but they knew rotten matter smelled bad, attracted vermin, spoiled comfort, and made shared spaces harder to live in. So a dead chicken left near a drain, a pile of dung outside a door, or a blocked gutter could anger an entire row of houses. The problem was not ignorance alone. It was crowded with labour, poverty, and limited infrastructure. Cleaning could be hard work. Someone had to lift the bucket, scrape the gutter, move the dung, push rubbish aside with a wooden shovel, or carry foul matter away from the busiest path. In a narrow street, there was rarely a perfect place to put anything. What one house removes, another house might smell. What one person ignored, 10 people had to step around, so lazy doorway became a public insult. The poor felt the rule differently from the comfortable. A wealthier household might have servants to sweep, carry waste, and manage the mess before the owner had to touch it. A poorer family had to do the lifting themselves after cooking, washing, working, and keeping children fed. A tired woman might look at the bucket by the door and know that carrying it properly meant another walk through mud, another smell on her hands, and another task before sleep. Still, The street could not survive everyone's exhaustion. If every house threw waste wherever it pleased, the lane would become a trench of rot. Carts would sink into soft filth, pigs would root through scraps, and rain would spread the mess from one doorstep to the next. The town did not need perfect cleanliness to know when a street had gone too far. The rules were rough protection. A blocked gutter could force dirty water back toward doorways. A pile of rubbish could trap moisture against wooden walls. A butcher's scraps, spoiled vegetables, broken straw and animal dung could join together in a smell that settled under low windows. People might still have to live beside it, cook beside it, and sleep above it. There was no escape inside. By evening, the narrow street could carry the whole day's waste. Mud stuck to shoes, flies gathered near scraps, and a pig might nose through the edges before someone shouted it away. A person returning home could tell which hand he cleaned and which had let the filth spread. The rule about dumping waste was not polite housekeeping. It was a way to stop one careless household from making everyone else live inside its dirt. A dirty bucket thrown into a medieval street was not just one person's mess, because the stink, flies, mud and waste could spread from one doorway to every house nearby. But the filth in the street attracted another problem, and some towns had to control the animals that fed on it, rooted through it, and dragged it through crowded lanes. Next, a muddy pig running loose between market stalls could knock over food, smear waste across the road, and turn a narrow town street into sudden chaos. Loose pigs could turn a medieval street into a mess before anyone had time to stop them. They were heavy, hungry animals moving through spaces already crowded with carts, children, stalls, baskets, mud, and people trying to earn enough for bread. They could root through rubbish, nose into doorways, knock over goods, bite when startled, and smear filth from one part of the street to another. In a narrow lane, that could become a real problem. The animal did not need to be wild. For a poor household, a pig could be valuable property. So it could turn scraps into meat, survive on waste, and become one of the few things a family owned that might later be sold, slaughtered, or traded. Keeping one close to home made sense when food was scarce, and every leftover crust, peel, and spoiled scrap mattered. Same animal that helped a family survive could make the street unbearable for everyone else. That was the conflict. A pig wandering through a market could do damage quickly. It might push its snout into a basket of vegetables, scatter onions across the ground, overturn a tray, or splash through a dirty gutter before brushing against someone's skirt. A child could press himself against a wall while the animal shoved past with mud on its legs and waste on its hide. The owner might come running with a rope, shouting and slipping behind it. The street would already be too full. Market space was not wide or clean. A baker might have boards of bread near the edge of the path. A woman might sell greens from a basket, and a fishmonger might keep his goods low enough for a pig to smell them. People moved with bundles, tools, jugs, and small coins, trying not to step into muck or bump into carts. A loose pig could turn ordinary crowding into sudden chaos. It could ruin a morning. Some towns and communities set rules to control animals in built-up spaces. This did not mean every medieval town banned pigs completely, or that people never kept them near houses. Rules varied, and enforcement depended on local need, custom, and the patience of neighbours. But when animals caused damage, dirt, danger, or blocked movement, towns had reason to act. A pig did not respect property lines. It could root under a stall, tear at rubbish, disturb graves near churchyards, or push through a yard where food had been left out. Its body carried mud, manure, straw, and street filth wherever it went. So it had just been feeding on waste. Everything it touched would have become part of the same problem. The mess moved with it. For the poor owner, being forced to restrain the animal could feel unfair. A rope, pen, gate, or watched yard took effort and space that many households did not have. If the pig fed itself in the street, that saved money. If it had to be contained, someone had to bring scraps, repair barriers, and keep it from escaping while also working, cooking, fetching water, and caring for children. Poverty made order difficult, but the neighbours had their own limits, so a woman who had swept the front of her doorway did not want a muddy pig dragging rubbish across it before noon. A seller who had counted on one basket of greens for the day could not easily replace what an animal had crushed. A child knocked down in the mud might come home crying with filth on his sleeves. The owner's convenience became everyone's cost. That cost could bring anger. Loose pigs also made the street feel unsafe. They were strong, low, stubborn animals, and a frightened or hungry one could bite, shove, or charge without warning. In a narrow lane there might be nowhere to step aside. A person carrying hot food, a pot, a bundle of cloth, or a child could lose balance fast. What sounds funny from far away was not funny at ground level. The smell added to the trouble. Pig rooting through refuse could pull old scraps into the open, spread dung, and disturb the waste. People had tried to pour wood gutters or edges. Flies gathered where food scraps were exposed. Mud became slick under feet, and the street could carry the stink long after the animal had been tied up again. One loose pig could make a whole row of houses complain. The rules were not about making towns neat by modern standards. Medieval streets could still be dirty, crowded, and full of smells even when people tried to control them. The point was damage reduction. A tied pig, a guarded pig, or a pig kept away from the busiest street caused less trouble than one roaming wherever hunger led it. That was the practical reason. By evening, the owner might finally drag the animal back by a rope, its feet sliding in mud while neighbours watched from doorways. The market seller might pick bruised vegetables from the ground. A child might rinse his dirty hands in cold water, and someone might scrape the gutter again with a wooden shovel. The pig would still be valuable. But everyone would remember the damage. A loose pig in a medieval town was not just a comic nuisance, because it could spread filth, knock over food, frighten children, and turn a narrow street into a fight over damage and blame. But the same market that feared muddy animals also had to face something even more dangerous lying openly on wooden boards. Meat and fish that had begun to rot before poor buyers could smell the truth. Soon a basket of spoiled fish with flies could look like dinner until it carried sickness back into her hungry family's home. Rotten meat in a medieval market did not need much time to become everyone's problem. A fish laid too long on a wooden board could soften at the belly, darken around the eyes, and draw flies before the buyer had finished counting coins. Meat could sit near smoke, mud, wet straw, animal dung, and too many warm bodies pressing through the same narrow space. The smell could hide inside other smells. That made buying food risky. A poor buyer could not always choose carefully. She might have only enough money for a small piece of fish, a rough cut of meat, or scraps left near the end of the trading day. Her children might be waiting at home with bread and thin broth, eating something stronger to make the meal feel complete. A cheaper piece could look like mercy when the purse was almost empty. It could also be a trap. The seller knew more than the customer. He knew how long the fish had been sitting, where the meat had come from, whether it had begun to sour, and whether the smell had been rubbed with salt, smoke, herbs, or quick handling to make it seem less dangerous. A buyer could bend close, sniff once, and hope her nose was enough. In a crowded market, hope was often rushed. Medieval people were not stupid about spoiled food. They did not understand bacteria in a modern scientific way. But they knew that bad smells, soft flesh, strange colour, and sickness after eating were connected, so rotten fish could announce itself clearly enough. A piece of meat crawling with flies did not need a physician to explain the danger. People had experience. That is why some towns tried to control what could be sold. Market officers, local officials, or appointed inspectors could look over meat and fish, question sellers, remove bad goods, could punish those who tried to cheat buyers. The rules were not perfect, and they did not make markets clean by modern standards. But they showed that communities understood spoiled food could harm more than one household, so bad sale could travel home in a basket. The fish might be wrapped in cloth, carried through a lane, placed beside bread, and cooked quickly before anyone wanted to waste it. A mother might cut away the worst and smell art and keep the rest because throwing it out meant losing the money completely. A labourer might eat it after a long day because hunger argued louder than caution. Poverty made danger negotiable. Inside a poor room, the meal could look ordinary at first, so a pot might steam over a low fire, and children might wait near the table, and the smell of cooking might cover the warning that had been obvious at the stall. Once eaten, the damage could come later. Stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, fever, and fear could turn a cheap supper into a night no one would forget. One bad meal could punish everyone. The seller's temptation was simple. Throwing away spoiled food meant losing money. Selling it quickly, cheaply, or to someone too poor to argue meant passing the loss to another body. A buyer with status might complain and be heard, so a poor woman with sick children might only be told she should have chosen better. That unfairness made inspection necessary. The market itself could help disguise the problem. Fish lay beside fish, knives were wiped on stained cloth, and boards held marks from earlier cuts. Smoke from cooking stalls drifted over everything, while mud stuck to shoes and flies moved from one surface to another. A basket of old fish could sit among fresher goods until only a careful eye noticed the difference. The smell of the town worked for the cheat. Still, sellers risked shame if caught, so a market official lifting a spoiled fish from a basket could turn a private trick into public disgrace. Neighbours might look over, buyers might step back, and other sellers might pretend to be busy while listening closely. A rotten piece of food on display could damage a name as surely as a false weight or sour ale. Trust was part of every sale. For the town, bad meat and fish were not only disgusting, they could bring sickness into crowded households, and sickness rarely stayed neatly inside one door. A vomiting child, a weak worker, or a feverish servant could unsettle an entire family already living close to hunger. Food that looked like help could become another burden. The fear was practical. By evening, the boards would be scraped, the knives wiped, and the flies would settle wherever scraps remained. Some buyers would carry honest food home, while others might carry something already turning bad inside the cloth. So in a place where money was scarce, people could not easily throw away what they had bought. That made the market's honesty matter before the food ever reached the pot. Spoiled meat and bad fish were not just unpleasant in a medieval market, because one dishonest sale could carry sickness into a poor family's only meal. But the danger did not begin at the stall, since blood, guts, knives, dogs, flies, and dirty water could gather wherever animals were too close to homes. Soon, a street corner used like a killing floor could send blood down the stones while hungry dogs waited beside the drain. Slaughtering an animal too close to homes could turn a medieval street into a place people wanted to avoid. Blood returned between stones. Scraps could fall near the gutter, and the smell of opened bodies could mix smoke, mud, dung, and cooking fires. So a butcher might work quickly with a knife in one hand and a wooden tub nearby. But the mess did not stay where he left it. It spread, the street carried everything. A poor buyer might not think first about cleanliness when meat was rare and money was short. She might stand near the butcher's place with a cloth bag, hoping for a cheap piece, a bit of fat or bones that could give strength to thin broth. Children at home might be waiting for something better than bread soaked in weak ale. Even a rough cut could feel like luck. That luck came with a smell. The killing itself was practical work, not a clean performance. An animal could be held, skinned, and divided while people passed nearby with baskets, jugs, and tools. Blood might splash onto stones already wet from rain and dirty water. Guts could be dropped into a tub, set aside too close to a wall, or left long enough for flies to gather. Dogs knew where to wait. They always knew. Some towns tried to push slaughtering away from the most crowded streets or limit where it could happen. This did not mean medieval towns had neat modern planning or clean slaughterhouses in every place. Rules varied, and many communities still lived with smells and mess that would shock modern people. But the reason for control was clear. Blood, waste animals, knives, flies and dirty water were too much to leave anywhere people pleased. So a butcher working near a doorway could make life miserable for the houses around him. A woman sweeping her threshold might find bloodwater sliding toward her door. A child sent to fetch bread might step around offal near the gutter. A servant carrying clean cloth could return with the smell of slaughter clinging to her skirt. What began as one trade became everyone's heir. Poor streets had little room to escape it. Rooms were small, windows opened low, and many families lived above or beside the work of others. A smell from the street could enter the place where people slept, ate, nursed babies, and stored bread. Smoke from the hearth might hide part of it, but it could not remove the sour weight of blood and entrails. The body noticed. So did the neighbours. The butcher also had pressure on him. Meat spoiled quickly, customers wanted fresh cuts, and animals had to be handled while there was still value in the carcass. Moving the work farther away could take time, labour, and space. Keeping it close to buyers made business easier. But easier for the butcher could mean worse for the street. The mess attracted more trouble. Dogs could pull at scraps, pigs could nose through waste, and flies could move from entrails to food stalls. Dirty water carrying blood might run into channels already blocked by mud and rubbish. A gutter that had smelled bad in the morning could become almost unbearable by afternoon. People did not need modern germ theory to know this was dangerous. They had noses. Town official or local authority looking at such work was not trying to make the place spotless by modern standards. He was trying to stop the worst parts from settling in the busiest spaces. Slaughter had to happen. It could be pushed to a specific place, watched more closely, or kept away from doors, markets, wells, and crowded crossings. The point was not perfection. It was control. For ordinary people, the rule meant fewer chances of walking through blood on the way to buy bread. So it meant less risk of dogs fighting near children, less rotten waste by the gutter, and fewer scraps left where flies could gather before moving to food. A poor family still lived among smoke, mud, and hard smells, but at least the street did not have to become a killing floor every day. That mattered more than it sounds. By evening, the butcher's knife might be wiped, the wooden tub carried off, and the last scraps taken away or fought over by animals. The stone could still be stained, and the drain could still hold a dark smell after water passed through it. People walking home would remember where the blood had run, and which doorway had suffered the worst of it. A rule about slaughter was really a rule about keeping one trade from swallowing the whole street. Slaughtering animals in the wrong place was not just an ugly sight, because blood, guts, flies, dogs, and dirty water could turn a shared street into a place of sickness and disgust. But the next danger could begin after dark, when ovens, brewing fires, and household embers sat too close to timber walls, straw roofs, and sleeping families. One careless coal left glowing in the night could do what blood in the gutter could not: burn an entire row of homes before dawn. Fire at night was one of the quiet fears of a medieval town. A cooking hearth, a baker's oven, a brewing fire, or a small lamp could seem harmless while someone was awake to watch it. But the same flame beside timber walls, straw roofs, dry floors, hanging cloth, and narrow lanes could become a disaster before neighbours understood what was happening. Darkness made fire harder to forgive, so one spark could travel. A poor household often lived close to its own heat. The hearth was where food was cooked, water was warmed, damp clothes were dried, and children gathered when the room grew cold. Sash, embers, smoke, pots, stools, baskets, bedding, and stored wood too near each other because there was not enough space to arrange them safely. The fire was useful every hour of the day. It was also dangerous. A woman baking late could keep embers alive because the family needed bread for the morning. Someone brewing ale might tend a fire longer than planned because the batch meant coins, food, rent, or fuel. A tired worker could come warm his hands, eat a small piece of bread, and leave the coals glowing under ash before sleep took him. In a crowded wooden town, that small carelessness could belong to everyone by dawn. The walls did not protect anyone well. Houses could lean close together, with upper floors nearly touching across the street. Roofs could be thatched, beams dry, doors low, and rooms packed with things that caught quickly. If one house burned, the next one did not have to be guilty. It only had to be near. That was enough. Some towns made rules about when fires could be used, how embers should be covered, and who was responsible if flames spread. These rules did not mean every medieval town burned constantly, or that people lived in panic every night. But fire was a real danger in a world without modern engines, hydrants, alarms, wiring standards, or fast, organized fire services. People had to prevent disaster before it began. A bucket by the door could be part of that fear. So could a shovel for ash, a covered hearth, a careful glance at the oven, or a neighbour looking from a window when smoke rose too late. The work of preventing fire was small and repeated, which made it easy to neglect. A person might think the coal was nearly dead. The town had to think about what would happen if it were not. Poor people carried the risk heavily. A wealthy family might lose property and still have somewhere to go. A poor family could lose bed, straw, tools, clothing, stored grain, a chest of small belongings, and the roof over every child in the room. There might be no spare blanket, no conned pot, no extra pair of shoes hidden safely elsewhere. Fire could turn poverty into nothing. It erased quickly. Night made the danger worse. People slept behind wooden doors while smoke gathered. Animals shifted in sheds, and embers breathed under ash. A child might wake before anyone saw flames. A neighbour might hear shouting. Then the scrape of feet, the crash of a bucket, and the terrible sound of someone trying to wake a whole street. By then, the fire might already be climbing. The narrow street could become a trap. People running out carried children, tools, bread, or whatever their hands could grab. Someone might stumble over a cart, a water bucket, or a pig tied too close to a doorway. Smoke could make the lane feel smaller than it already was. A town built tightly for work, and shelter could become tightly built for burning. That is why ovens and brewing fires mattered. A baker's oven was not only his own business when it stood near other homes. A brewer's fire was not only her household's concern when sparks could catch straw above the next wall. Even a small domestic hearth became a public danger once people slept. The line between private work and shared disaster was thin. The rule was practical. By morning, a town that survived the night might look ordinary again. Smoke stains on walls, ash in the hearth, a covered coal, and a bucket still half full by the door could seem like small things. People would return to bread, ale, market stalls, animals, and muddy lanes. But everyone knew that one night of carelessness could change the street forever. A careless night fire was not just a household mistake, because one glowing coal could take bread, tools, beds, roofs, and sleeping families with it. But the fear of fire did not end with private hearths, and some communities used the evening bell to remind every house that flame had to be covered before darkness settled fully. Soon the sound of a bell over a dark street could mean the difference between safe embers and children waking to smoke under a burning roof. The evening bell in a medieval town did more than mark the end of the day. Its sound moved over roofs, lanes, yards, workshops, and small rooms where people were still cooking, mending, brewing, warming water, or finishing tasks by fading light. To modern ears, a curfew bell can sound like control, as if the town only wanted people indoors and obedient, but fire made the bell practical. Darkness needed warning. A poor household did not end its labour just because the sun was low. So a woman might still be stirring a pot of thin broth, drying a damp sleeve near the hearth, or trying to warm water for a child before sleep. A man might come back late with cold hands, muddy shoes, and a need for heat before lying down on straw or a rough bed. The fire gave comfort after a hard day. It also watched for weakness. When the bell rang, people knew what had to be done. Embers could be covered with ash, small flames lowered, lamps checked, oven mouths closed, and doors barred against the night. A careless coal left breathing under a dry edge of wood could wake again after everyone slept. In a town of timber, straw, cloth, and crowded walls, that was enough to frighten any sensible neighbour. One coal could betray a street. The sound of the bell gave the whole community the same reminder. At the same time, it told the baker to think of his oven, the brewer to look at the fire under her vessel, the mother to cover the hearth, and the old man to check the lamp near his bed. It did not make the town safe in any modern way. It simply forced attention before darkness made mistakes harder to see. That mattered after sunset. Medieval nights were not empty or clean. The smoke could hang under low roofs, animals shifted in sheds, and narrow lanes went dark except for small glows behind shutters. People slept close to their belongings because they owned so little and had nowhere else to put them. A chest, a stool, a blanket, stored grain, firewood and bedding might all share the same cramped space with the hearth. Poor rooms burned quickly. A wealthy household might have more space, more servants, and better chances of saving goods if trouble came. A poor family had fewer hands, fewer exits, and fewer things they could afford to lose. Fire caught, it could take the family's bread, tools, clothes, bedding, and rent money in one night. Losing a house did not simply mean moving elsewhere. It meant falling lower. The bell could feel restrictive, especially to people who still had work to finish. A baker might resent leaving an oven too early. A brewer might fear that stopping a fire would weaken a batch that was supposed to bring coins. A tired mother might not want another task before sleep, especially when her hands were already rough from water, ash, and work. Still, the bell did not care about tiredness. Fire did not either. A neighbour hearing the bell might glance through a low window to see whether smoke still rose too strongly from the next house. Someone closing a wooden door might pause at the smell of hot straw or watch for light under a shutter. In close streets, people had to notice one another because danger moved from house to house. Privacy was thin when roofs nearly touched. The whole street shared the risk. Curfew should not be reduced to one simple idea. In some places it could be tied to order, movement, crime, work, and authority. But in a fire-prone town, it also had a practical edge. The bell made flame a public concern before it became a public disaster. That was the reason. By night, the street might settle into darkness. Doors were closed, animals quieted, and small lines of smoke faded above roofs. Inside, a woman could spread ash over the hearth, tap the edge with a tool, and listen for the last crackle before lying down. The bell's sound would pass, but its warning stayed in the room. People slept beside embers. The evening bell was not only a symbol of control, but it also reminded every household that one careless flame could become a disaster for the whole street. But some medieval work made foulness so strong that towns did not just control the hour, they controlled the place where certain trades could exist. Tanner's yard at the edge of town could stink of urine, lime, rotting hides, and river water so badly that the rest of the community wanted it pushed out of sight. Some medieval trades could not hide what they were doing. Tanner's yard, a dyeing shed, a soap-maker's corner, or a place where hides were scraped and soaked could announce itself before anyone reached the door. The smell of urine, lime, wet skins, animal fat, smoke, old water, and rotting scraps could drift into lanes, cling to clothing, and settle near the riverbank. The work was useful, but it was hard to live beside. The stink had weight. A town needed these workers. Shoes had to be made, belts had to be cut, leather straps had to hold tools and harness, dyed cloth had to be sold, and soap had to be produced in some form. A poor labourer needed strong leather shoes for mud and stone, while a servant might need a repaired strap or a piece of dyed cloth that could last through months of wear. These goods did not appear cleanly from nowhere. Someone had to handle the filth. So if you enjoy this kind of quiet, grounded history, you can like the video and subscribe so the next parts can keep moving through the stranger corners of medieval life. The work behind ordinary objects was often dirtier than the object itself. A belt in the market looked simple, but before it reached a buyer's hand, a hide might have been soaked, scraped, stretched, treated, and dried in air that no polite household wanted near its window. Respectable people used the result while avoiding the process. That was the hypocrisy. Tanners could work with hides that still carried the smell of the animal. The skins might hang from beams, lie in tubs, or be dragged across a yard, while hands scraped away hair and flesh. Slime could burn the skin, stale urine could help loosen hair, and dirty water could run toward ditches or streams already burdened with other waste. The ground underfoot could stay wet for days. The body was carried home. A worker's hands might be stained, cracked and rough from soaking, scraping, lifting, and stirring. His sleeves could smell even after washing, and his shoes might carry the yard's mud back through the edge of town. A poor wife or child might know the workday by the odour before he entered the room. The trade fed the household, but it also marked it. People noticed. Some towns pushed certain dirty trades toward the margins, near water, outside dense residential streets, or into areas where the smell and waste caused less trouble for the centre. This did not mean every unpleasant trade was banned everywhere, or that every town had perfect planning. The rules varied, and many places still lived with terrible smells, but the basic reason was practical enough. The mess had to go somewhere. Dyers could bring their own problems. Cloth might be soaked in coloured liquid, rinsed, lifted, wrung out, and hung while dye-stained fingers, boards and water channels. Bright cloth in the market could begin with dark tubs, sour liquid, and hands that stayed blue, red, brown, or black long after the work was done. A buyer might admire the colour without wanting to smell the place that made it. Beauty had a dirty workshop. Soap-making and fat rendering could be just as unpleasant. Animal fat, ash, heat and strong smells could fill a workroom and push through cracks. A poor worker might stand close to boiling matter because moving away meant losing the batch. The same town that wanted cleaner hands and cleaner clothes did not want the smell of making those things under its nose. So the workers were pushed outward. For the people doing the labour, that distance could feel like an insult. Their trades were necessary, but their bodies, yards and smells could make them seem lower in the eyes of others. They might sell goods used by wealthier people while being kept away from the cleanest streets. A man who made leather for respectable feet could still be treated as if his own hands were shameful. That kind of rejection stays with a person. Still, the town had reasons to worry. Waste from hides, dyes, fat, lime, and animal matter could foul water, attract insects, and make nearby living spaces unbearable. A narrow street already had smoke, dung, rubbish, and damp walls to manage. Adding soakang hides and chemical tubs to the middle of it could make ordinary life worse for everyone nearby. The edge of town became a compromise. It was not fair. By evening, hides might hang in the dim air, tub might sit with scum at the surface, and workers might rinse their hands in water that did little to remove the smell. Town centre could look calmer because the worst parts of production had been pushed away from its busiest doors. People still bought shoes, straps, soap, and dyed cloth. They just did not want to live beside the making of them. Dirty trades at the edge of town were not useless work because they created the leather, cloth, soap, straps, and tools that ordinary life depended on while forcing poor workers to carry the stink. But the market had another kind of dirt that could not be pushed to the riverbank. Dishonest weight, false measures, and small thefts hidden inside everyday trade. A crooked scale on a wooden stall could steal from a hungry buyer one handful at a time without leaving a single visible wound. A crooked scale could steal without making a sound. In a medieval market, a buyer might stand before a stall with a few coins, watching grain poured into a sack, meat placed on a board, or cloth stretched along a wooden measure. The seller's hands moved faster than the buyer's eyes, touching weights, cords, knives, and bags that the customer had to trust. A small cheat could look like ordinary trade. That was the danger. A poor household did not need to lose much before the loss became real. A handful of grain missing from a sack could mean thinner porridge. A strip of cloth cut short could mean a patched sleeve that failed sooner in cold weather. A piece of meat that weighed lightly could leave less fat for the pot and less strength for the next day's work. The theft was small only to the person taking it. For the buyer, suspicion became part of shopping. A woman might watch the seller's fingers as he placed an iron weight on the scale. A labourer might lean closer when grain was measured, trying to see whether the sack was filled properly. A servant sent from a household might fear being blamed if she returned with less than expected. Every purchase carried a quiet test. Trust could be expensive. Medieval markets often used rules about weights, medjver, dealing, because ordinary buyers had little power once money changed hands. A seller with a false weight, a shortened measure, or a tilted scale could cheat many people before being caught. The market did not need perfect modern regulation to understand the problem, so wrong measure, repeated all day, became a steady theft. The tools looked simple: a wooden rod for cloth, an iron weight for grain, a balance for meat, a scoop for dry goods, and a marked container for liquid. But each tool could be honest or dishonest depending on who held it. Shaved measure, a hidden hand on the scale, or a weight made slightly too light could turn normal buying into a trick. The poor felt it first. A wealthy customer might complain loudly, choose another seller, or send someone stronger to argue. This poor buyer often had to accept what was handed over because there was no money for a second purchase. If she discovered the cheat at home, it was already too late. The stall, the seller, and the crowd had moved on. Inside a poor room, the loss became visible. Grain poured into a pot might not reach as high as expected. Cloth bought for a child's garment might not cover both arms properly. Meat that seemed enough in the market might shrink into a few pieces once cut over the table. The cheated measure followed the buyer into the evening meal. Hunger made arithmetic cruel. A crooked seller did not need to rob one person dramatically. He could take a little from everyone. One missing handful from a sack, one finger when torn stolen from cloth, 1 ounce kept back from meat, and by sunset the stall had gathered profit from many small losses. No single buyer might be able to prove it, Together, they had all paid. That is why public checking mattered. A market official inspecting weights could make a seller nervous before a crowd. An iron weight might be tested, a wooden measure compared, or a balance watched while buyers stood nearby pretending not to stare. If the tool was false, the shame could land as hard as the fine. Reputation mattered where the same faces returned each week. A bad name could empty a stall. Not every market was controlled well, and not every official was honest. Some cheating still passed unnoticed, especially when the crowd was thick and buyers were tired, but the effort to standardize measures came from a real need. Trade could not survive if every sack, rod, and scale became a private weapon. The market depended on common trust. A baker needed fair grain, a butcher needed fair weights, a cloth seller needed a trusted measure, and a poor family needed to know that their coins had bought what they were promised. Without that, buying food or clothes became a gamble. The weakest people had the least room to lose. By evening, the stall boards would be swept, the weights packed away, and the measuring rods leaned against a wall. Buyers would carry grain, cloth, meat, or salt, back through streets where every coin had already been counted. Some would never know they had been cheated. Others would know only when the pot looked too empty. False weights and crooked measures were not dry market problems because they could steal food, cloth, and money from poor buyers, one small loss at a time. But medieval law did not only watch what people sold, but it also watched what people wore, because clothing could make a servant, merchant, or labourer look dangerously above their place. Fine fur, bright cloth, or forbidden silk on the wrong body could turn ordinary clothing into a public accusation. Fine clothing could make a person visible in ways that were not always safe. In a medieval town, cloth did more than cover the body, because it told neighbours what someone was supposed to be. Wool, linen, fur, silk, dyed fabric, metal clasps, belts, and jewellery could speak before the person wearing them said a word. A sleeve could become a statement. People watched clothing closely. A poor young man might own little more than a worn tunic, rough hose, patched shoes, and a belt that had been repaired too many times. Servant girl might have a plain dress, an apron, a head covering, and sleeves faded by washing, smoke, and work. When someone like that appeared in brighter cloth, finer trim, or a belt that looked above their station, eyes could follow them through the street. The fabric changed how the body was read. That could become dangerous. To modern people, laws about dress can sound absurd. It seems strange that anyone in power would care whether a merchant's wife wore fur, whether a labourer used expensive cloth, or whether a young person dressed above the rank into which they had been born. But medieval clothing was tied to status, morality, occupation, wealth, and order, helped a community decide who was noble, who was respectable, who served, who worked, and who was expected to stay low. A person could look like a lie. This did not mean every place controlled clothing in the same way. Rules varied by region, period, class, and local authority, and not every garment caused trouble everywhere. Still, sumptuary laws and social pressure reflected a real fear among elites and communities that outward appearance could blur boundaries. If clothing stopped showing rank, then rank itself felt less secure. That was the fear behind the fabric. For poor people, the desire to dress better was not hard to understand. A good belt, a warmer lining, a brighter sleeve, or a piece of fur could make someone feel less worn down by hunger, mud, labour, and obedience. A young worker might save coins for cloth that made him look less like someone ordered around all day. So a woman might keep one better garment for church, market days, or moments when she wanted to be seen with dignity. That wish was human. But the town could be cruel about it. A person wearing something too fine might be laughed at, suspected, reported, or corrected by those who believed they had no right to appear that way. In church, eyes might move over a sleeve, a clasp, or a strip of expensive trim. In the market, neighbours might notice a colour that seemed too costly for the wearer's family. Clothing made private ambition public. The shame could be quiet. A poor person did not need to wear a crown to offend. A better cloak, a rich dye, a fur edge, or a piece of jewellery could be enough if others believed it crossed the line. The problem was not only wealth, it was the suggestion that a lower person wanted to look higher. Medieval society often treated that desire as disorder. The body had a place, clothing also carried moral judgment. Fine dress could be accused of pride, vanity, waste, or deception. A person who dressed above their station might be seen as pretending, seducing, boasting, or refusing the humility expected of them. This was not fair, but it made sense inside a world where public appearance and social rank were tightly joined. A garment could be judged like behaviour. Poor households felt the pressure sharply. Cloth costs money, and even ordinary clothing took work to make, mend, wash, and preserve. A mother might patch a child's tunic at night by dim light, saving every piece of usable fabric. A worker might wear the same garment through sweat, rain, smoke, and field dirt until the seams weakened. To own something better was not simply vanity, it was relief. That is why clothing laws can feel especially bitter. They did not only stop luxury, they could also remind people that even looking better than their condition might be treated as a problem. A servant could polish the silver of a household that wore fine cloth, then return to her own plain dress. A craftsman could make beautiful things for others while being expected to remain visibly modest himself. The unfairness was plain. Still, from the viewpoint of the society that made these rules, clothing helped keep order visible. A noble did not want to be mistaken for a prosperous merchant. A master did not want servants dressing like equals. Authorities did not want weddings, church gatherings, markets, or public ceremonies filled with people using cloth to challenge rank. They feared confusion. They called it order. By evening, the fine garment might be folded away, hidden in a chest, or worn only where the risk seemed worth it. The person who owns it might touch the fabric with pride and anxiety at the same time. A strip of fur or bright cloth could warm the skin, but it could also draw judgment. In that world, clothing did not simply sit on the body, it placed the body in society. Fine clothing was not just decoration in a medieval town, because silk, fur, bright dyes, and jewellery could make a person seem to challenge the rank they were expected to obey. But clothing was not the only place where society tried to stop people from reaching above their means, because weddings could push poor families into public displays they could barely afford. Soon, a wedding feast meant to prove honour could leave family counting debts beside empty bowls had gone. A wedding feast could look joyful from the outside and still leave a poor family afraid of the morning after. Long tables, bread, roasted meat, ale, candles, borrowed cloth, and relatives dressed in their best could make one day feel larger than ordinary life. People came to eat, watch, compare, remember, and judge whether the family had honoured the marriage properly. Celebration was never only a celebration, it was public proof. A poor father might count coins in the corner while guests filled cups at the table. A mother might look at the bread and meat, wondering if there would be enough to avoid shame. The bride might wear the best dress the family could manage, with sleeves brushed clean and every old repair hidden as carefully as possible. A wedding could turn private poverty into a public display. That pressure was heavy. Some communities and authorities tried to limit wedding feasts, gifts, clothing, the number of guests, or the amount of food served. This did not mean every medieval place banned large weddings, or that every feast was treated the same way. Rules varied by town, region, custom, and social rank. But the fear behind them was real. Honour could become debt. A family did not want neighbours whispering that the table looked poor. They did not want guests leaving hungry, relatives feeling insulted, or the marriage remembered as a small and shameful affair. If another household had served more meat, poured better ale, or offered finer gifts, the comparison could sting for years. Pride could cost more than hunger allowed. The poor knew this too well. A wedding might require borrowed money, promised labour, stored grain, slaughtered animals, or favours owed to people who would later expect repayment. A family could empty a chest, sell a tool, delay repairs, or use food that might have carried them through a harder week. The feast ended in a day, but the debt stayed. Guests remembered the meal, while the family remembered what it had cost. The room after the wedding could feel different. Benches might be pushed aside, crumbs scattered on boards, cups left sticky, and bones picked clean near the edge of the table. The bride's dress could hang limp after being worn in smoke, heat, and crowded air. Someone might gather leftover bread carefully, not as a treat, but because tomorrow still needed food. Morning came anyway. The rules against excess can sound cruel because they touched a happy event. So wedding was one of the few moments when ordinary people could step out of their hard routine and feel seen by the whole community. Cutting down the feast, the clothes, or the gifts could feel like making joy smaller, but an uncontrolled display could punish the weakest families most. Wealthy people could spend and recover. Poor families could spend and sink. A rich household might show honour with extra dishes, better wine, musicians, cloth and gifts without risking its next month of food. A poorer household trying to imitate that display might borrow against its future. The same custom could be pride for one family and ruin for another. That was the trap. The desire to appear respectable was not foolish. In a world where reputation affected marriage, work, trust, and standing, looking poor at a public ceremony could damage more than feelings. A family wanted the bride to be received well, the groom's side to feel respected, and the neighbours to say the day had been proper. Shame had a social price, so people stretched beyond what they had. The food itself carried the pressure. Bread had to be enough. Ale had to last. Meat had to appear generous, and no important guest could be seen with an empty cup too soon. A poor relative might quietly count what was left on the table. Someone might cut smaller pieces near the end, hoping no one would notice. Hospitality became arithmetic. The law stepped into that dangerous arithmetic. It could limit extravagance, not because joy was evil, but because competition could become destructive. So rule about feast size, gifts, or clothing could stop families from being dragged into a public contest they could not afford. It was controlled, but it could also act like a break, not a kind break, but a useful one. There was still unfairness in it. Limits often protected social order as much as poor households. So authorities did not want lower people imitating higher ranks, and they did not want public celebrations turning into claims of status. A wedding feast could become another stage where society watched. Who ate, who gave, who wore what, and who dared to seem larger than their place. The joy was watched. By the time the guests left, the family could finally see the real cost. The table was bare, the cups needed washing, the fire was low, and the best cloth had to be folded away. A few coins might remain, or none. The marriage had begun, but the household still had to survive the week. So lavish wedding was not just a happy feast in a medieval community, because honour, food, clothing, and public judgment could push a poor family into debt for one day of approval. But crowded public life carried another danger, and the market could turn from buying and selling to violence when anger, weapons, money and drink met in the same narrow space. A single knife drawn beside a fallen stall could scatter coins through the mud, while a family's food money disappeared under running feet. Market peace mattered because the market carried too many fragile things at once. Bread, fish, cloth, onions, ale tools, coins, baskets, and tired bodies all pressed into the same narrow space. People came hungry, suspicious, rushed, and sometimes already angry from debt, bad bargains, or drink taken too early in the day. Small quarrel did not need much help. It could spread fast. A poor buyer might enter the market with only a few coins hidden in her hand. She could be trying to buy bread, a cheap piece of fish, a handful of beans, or cloth enough to patch a child's sleeve. If a fight broke out near her, the day's money could fall into mud, vanish under her feet, or be snatched before she could bend down. Disorder punished the weakest first. The stalls were easy to damage. Shove could send a basket of greens across the ground, knock a board of bread into dirt, or spill ale over a seller's feet. A man reaching for a knife at his belt could make the whole crowd move backward at once. The people closest to him might not know whether to run, hold their goods, or protect their children. Fear made bodies clumsy. Coins rolled quickly. This did not mean every medieval market was a battlefield. People bought, sold, bargained, joked, worked, and returned home without violence on countless ordinary days. But because the market was so important, many towns had good reason to protect it from fighting, weapons, and public disorder. Trade needed trust, and trust could not survive if buyers feared being struck while choosing food. A knife in the wrong place changed the air. So many people carried blades for work, eating, travel, or daily use, so the issue was not always simple. But a tool could become a weapon when tempers rose near money, drink, and insult. A butcher's knife, a belt knife, a stick, or even a heavy tool could turn a quarrel into blood on the stones. The crowd knew that. A seller might pull his goods back when voices rose. A woman with eggs might lift her basket against her chest and step away from the shouting. A child could press against a wall, watching boots slide through mud while adults pushed past. One overturned stall could ruin food that had taken hours to prepare, and money that seller could not replace. The poor seller had little protection. A basket of vegetables might be the day's income. A few loaves, a pot of ale, or a tray of cheap fish might be all that stood between the household and another night of thin food. If a fight destroyed the stall, the loss did not end when the crowd settled. It followed the seller home. That made market peace practical. Its rules against fighting or carrying weapons in certain market spaces were not just about mass. They protected buying, selling, movement, and the small confidence that people needed before bringing goods into public. A town could not afford a market where every argument might scatter buyers. Merchants, farmers, servants, apprentices, and widows all depended on the place working. Anger was bad for trade. Officials or local authorities could punish those who broke the peace, threatened others, or caused disorders. The punishment could vary, and no market was controlled perfectly. A drunk man might still shout, a cheated buyer might still grab a seller's sleeve, and a dispute over price could still draw a crowd. But the rule gave the community a line. People needed that line. By afternoon, the market might already be loud from bargaining, animals, wheels, and voices. Add spilled ale, a bad bargain, a rude word, or a hand on a knife, and the mood could shift at once. A peaceful crowd could become a ring of watchers, then a pushing mass, then a place where no one remembered whose coin fell first. The damage moved faster than the argument. A market could not live like that. By evening, the broken vegetables might be swept aside, a fallen board lifted, and the crowd's story repeated in kitchens, taverns, and doorways. Someone would remember the knife, someone the spilled coins, someone the child pulled out of the way. The market would open again, but the fear would stay in people's minds. Its rules against violence were a way of keeping tomorrow possible. A fight in a medieval market was not just a burst of anger, because one drawn knife or overturned stall could destroy food, scatter coins, and make poor buyers lose what little they had. But disorder did not only come from shouting men and weapons, because even the ground outside each house could become dangerous when residents refused to clean it. After that, a blocked gutter, a slick patch of waste, and a rotting heap by one doorway could make an entire street slip, stink, and suffer for one lazy household. The ground outside a medieval house was not truly private. A doorway opened straight into the life of the street, where neighbours passed with baskets, buckets, animals, tools, and children close behind them. Mud, straw, spilled water, dung, broken wood, and food scraps could gather in front of one home, and then spread under many feet. Dirt did not respect a threshold, it travelled. A poor household might already be tired before the street needed attention. Someone had cooked, fetched water, patched clothing, carried fuel, washed a child, or worked for another family since early morning. The rough broom near the door could sit untouched because hands were sore and the room inside still needed work. Cleaning the street might feel like one more demand on a life already full of demands. Still, the mess stayed visible. A blocked gutter could make dirty water sit in front of several houses. Its rain might turn old straw and waste into a slick patch where a person could slip while carrying bread, ale, or firewood. A cartwheel could sink into a soft, dirty edge and force people to push around it. A rotting pile near one doorway could make the whole lane smell worse. Neighbours would notice. Some towns expected residents to keep the area before their homes usable. This might mean sweeping, clearing gutters, moving rubbish, repairing small hazards, or keeping the way open enough for people and carts to pass. It did not make streets clean by modern standards, and many places remained muddy, crowded, and full of unpleasant smells. But the rule came from a simple problem. There was no modern service to fix everything. Poor streets depended on small acts of shared work. A woman with a coarse broom might push wet straw toward the edge of the lane. A man might scrape a gutter with a wooden shovel, trying to make foul water move again. A child might be told to pick up broken sticks before someone trips. None of this looked grand, but it kept daily life from becoming worse. The work was dirty and thankless. A resident could resent being forced to clean. So why should one tired person scrape the street when animals, carts, rain, and careless neighbours would ruin it again by evening? Why spend time clearing a drain when there was bread to earn, cloth to mend, and a fire to tend? In a poor household, every task competed with another task. Public responsibility could feel like punishment, but the street made everyone responsible. A dirty patch in front of one house did not stay politely in front of that house. It stuck to shoes, splashed onto skirts, blocked wheels, attracted flies, and carried stink toward the next doorway. A low window could take in the smell from a neighbour's heap. A child playing nearby could step into the waste and bring it back indoors. One household's neglect became another household's flaw. That was the anger behind the rule. Narrow towns made this worse. Houses stood close, doors were low, and lanes were often too tight for easy movement. A board left across the way, a broken stone, or a pile of rubbish could turn an ordinary walk into an obstacle. A person carrying water might spill the bucket. A seller with goods for the market might lose time before the day had even begun. Small hazards became public trouble. The rule was not proof that medieval streets were clean or carefully managed. Many were not. It was proof that people understood how quickly shared space could break down. Without constant effort, gutters clogged, path smells thickened, and quarrels began over whose dirt had caused whose suffering. The poor paid for bad streets in their bodies. Sweat shoes could mean cold feet all day. A fall in the mud could ruin clothing that could not be easily replaced. A blocked route could make a worker late, a servant scolded, or a seller lose the best hour of trade. Dirty streets did not hurt everyone equally. They hurt the tired first. By evening, The person who had swept might see new mud already dragged across the ground. The gutter might still smell, the stones might still be slick, and a neighbour might still glance with judgment at the doorway that looked worst. Yet the effort mattered, because without it the lane would sink into filth faster. Small, cleaned space could keep the street usable for one more day. Keeping the ground before a house clean was not just town control, because one blocked gutter or rotting heap could make an entire lane stink, flood, and turn dangerous under poor people's feet. So the next rule reached deeper into fear, because sickness could make a person's own doorway become a boundary. Others were afraid to cross. A closed door, a marked house, and a basket of food left outside could show that one sick body had become a warning to the whole street. Sick person in a medieval town could become frightening before anyone understood exactly what was wrong. Fever, coughing, swellings, weakness, strange marks on the skin, or a sudden death in one room could make neighbours step back from a doorway they had passed every day. So people might whisper from across the lane, avoid the house, or send food without touching the person inside. Fear changed distance. The door became a line. A poor family had little space for sickness. Several people might sleep in one room, share the same fire, eat from the same pot, and breathe the same damp air. As one person began coughing through the night, everyone heard it. If a child grew hot with fever, the mother might hold him close, even while knowing that closeness could endanger the rest of the household. Love made separation harder. Some medieval communities used isolation when disease seemed dangerous. Sick person might be kept away from crowds, a household might be avoided, travel might be limited, or a door might be marked, so others knew not to enter carelessly. These actions could be harsh, frightening, and lonely, but they were not always random cruelty or pure superstition. People watched the illness move. They did not understand infection in the modern way, and their explanations could mix religion, bad air, moral fear, astrology, and practical observation. Still, they could notice that sickness sometimes followed contact, shared rooms, crowded streets, ships, markets, and households. When one death became several, and several became many, distance began to look like the only tool left. So without modern medicine, prevention was often all they had. That tool hurt. A person shut away could hear life continue outside. Carts still passed, church bells still rang, children still shouted in the street, and neighbours still carried bread and water home. The sick person might lie behind a closed door, listening to footsteps stop short of the threshold, so a basket of food left outside could feel like mercy and rejection at the same time. The silence was heavy. Poor households suffered in cruel ways. If the sick person were a worker, wages could stop. If the mother were ill, children might be left hungry, dirty, or afraid. So if a servant was suspected of carrying a disease, she could lose both shelter and work. Sickness was never only a condition of the body. It attacked survival. Neighbours also had reason to fear. A narrow street could carry danger quickly from one house to another. People shared wells, markets, churches, carts, tools, and air thick with smoke and damp. If a disease spread through that in the town, no family could feel safe for long. Keeping one doorway closed might seem cruel, but leaving it open could feel worse. That was the terrible choice. Isolation could turn ordinary objects into signs of fear. A closed shutter, a marked door, a cup left untouched, a cloth held over the mouth, or a loaf placed on the ground instead of handed directly to someone could show how far trust had broken down. People who had shared benches at church might suddenly stand apart. A familiar face could become something to avoid, the sick noticed. This should not be described as if medieval people had clean, modern quarantine systems everywhere. Rules varied widely, and many measures were uneven, late, or badly enforced. Some responses were shaped by panic as much as practical sense. But The basic idea of keeping dangerous illnesses away from crowds had a real logic. Distance could save lives. For the person inside the house, that logic did not remove the pain. Fever sweat could stop bedding. Coughing could leave the chest sore, and fear could grow worse when no one dared come close. So a family member might stand outside the door, wanting to enter, holding back because the rest of the household still needed protection. The rule made human care feel dangerous. By evening, the street might grow quieter around the marked house. Its neighbours could lower their voices when passing, leave a small basket near the threshold, and move away before anyone opened the door. Behind the wall, someone might cough again, and everyone nearby would hear it. The rule had done its work, but it had also made loneliness part of survival. Its isolation was not just a cold medieval rule, because a closed door could separate the sick from food, work, family touch, and the ordinary sounds of the street. But the next rule went even further, because some people with feared long-term diseases were marked not only for a few days, but for life. Soon a rough cloak, a hidden hand, and a small warning bell could make one suffering person sound like danger before anyone saw their face. Leprosy could make a person feared before anyone understood the illness clearly. Changes in the skin, damaged hands, wounds, numbness, and visible deformity could turn an ordinary body into something. Neighbours watched with alarm. So people might step away from the road, avoid touching the same cup, or lower their voices when the sick person passes. The disease changed how others saw the whole person. That was the cruelty. A man or woman with leprosy might still have memories of normal life. They might have once worked in a field, carried goods through the market, sat with family at a table, or walked into church without making people move aside. Then the illness became visible, and the same streets began to feel different. A familiar doorway could become a place where people stared instead of being welcomed. Fear made distance grow. Some medieval communities required people with leprosy to live apart, wear identifying clothing, carry a bell, or avoid close contact with others. These rules were often harsh, and they mixed practical fear with religion, shame, misunderstanding, and social rejection. The purpose was not simply one thing. It was disease control, public warning, moral anxiety, and fear of a body that seemed to be changing frighteningly. The cost was human. A rough cloak or special garment could mark a person before they spoke. A covered hand, a hood, or a bell held in tired fingers could turn their presence into a warning sign. Someone walking on a road outside town might hear people move aside before they even come close. The sound of the bell could announce loneliness. It followed them everywhere. This should not be softened into a kind story. People with leprosy could be treated as dangerous, unclean, sinful, pitiful, or already half removed from ordinary life. Some received charity or religious care, and some communities provided places for them to live. But care did not erase exclusion. Food might be given from a distance. Compassion could still come with fear. A person could be helped and rejected at the same time. For a poor sufferer, separation could be devastating. Its work might disappear because no one wanted them near tools, animals, customers, or shared food. Family contact could shrink to brief visits, left baskets, or words spoken from several steps away. A sick person might depend on charity while knowing every gift reminded them they no longer belonged fully among others. Poverty made isolation sharper. The body was not the only thing damaged. Daily life became smaller. A road outside town, a leper house, a rough bed, a simple bowl, and the same few faces could replace the market, church crowd, workshop, or family room. Hands that once worked could be hidden. Feet that once crossed the street freely could stop before the edge of a settlement. The person still lived, but public life moved without them. That kind of loss is hard to measure. The community's fear was not invented from nothing. Leprosy was a long, visible, difficult disease, and medieval people had few tools for understanding or treating it. They could see bodies change over time, and they could fear contact even when their explanations were incomplete or wrong. Keeping distance seemed like protection when medicine had little to offer. But fear does not make cruelty painless. It only explains why it happened. So a bell in the hand was especially harsh because it turned movement into a public warning. Every step could make a sound. Every sound could tell others to look, move away, or prepare themselves. A person who wanted to pass quietly could not fully do so if the rule required them to announce their own danger. The disease had already marked the body, and the rule marked the air around it. The shame became audible. Children might stare from behind a doorway. Adults might leave food where it could be picked up without touching their hands. A former neighbour might nod but not come close. A family member might stand on the road with tears held back because love and fear had been forced into the same moment. The rule protected the community by isolating the sick person's place inside it. By evening, the person might return to the edge of town with dust on the hem of a rough cloak and the bell quiet in their hand. Behind them, the streets, markets, church steps, and warm rooms continued as before. The world had not ended. It had simply learned to go on without making room for them. Leprosy rules were not only about disease, because they could strip a suffering person of work, touch, dignity, and the right to move through town without warning others away. But medieval fear did not stop with sick bodies, because even a badly built wall, roof, bridge, or tower could kill people who never saw the mistake being made. Single loose stone above a crowded street could wait silently for years before falling onto the person walking below. A badly built wall in a medieval town did not look dangerous until it moved. Stones could sit above a street for years, held by mortar, timber supports, and the skill of the hands that placed them. People walked beneath walls, gates, roofs, bridges, and towers while carrying bread, water, tools, cloth, or children, rarely thinking about the weight above their heads. Trust was built into every step. Then one crack could change everything. A mason's work carried more pressure than it might seem. He did not only shape stone or spread mortar, he decided how weight would sit, how corners would hold, how wet mortar would dry, and whether a wall would stand through wind, rain, frost, and years of use. A careless hand could leave danger hidden inside the building itself. The mistake could wait. Medieval construction was not simply crude or ignorant. Many builders created churches, bridges, halls, walls, and towers that required real skill, planning, experience, and practical knowledge. Stone arches, timber frames, foundations, scaffolds, and roofs all demanded judgment. The danger was not that medieval people knew nothing. The danger was that bad work could kill before anyone had time to correct it. A poor passerby had no choice but to trust the builder. She might walk beside a newly raised wall with a basket on her arm, keeping close to the stones because the lane was narrow. A child might run beneath scaffolding, while men worked above with dust in their hair and tools at their belts. A labourer might lean against a wall at noon, eating bread from a cloth. None of them could inspect the structure. They lived under other men's decisions. A mason could be tempted by speed, pressure, or poor material. Better stone might cost more, stronger timber might be harder to get. A rushed job could please a patron for a while, especially if the wall looked straight from the outside. Weakness could be hidden behind surface order. That was the frightening part. Wet mortar, uneven stones, shallow foundations, weak beams, or bad repairs could turn into a disaster slowly. Rain could enter cracks. Frost could open them wider. Heavy roofs could press down on walls that had never been strong enough. By the time ordinary people noticed, the danger might already be hanging over them. Some guilds, towns, landlords, or patrons tried to control builders, materials, training, and responsibility because the stakes were serious. Rules could vary widely, and not every place had the same standards, but the need for oversight was practical. A poorly made shoe might tear, and a bad loaf might cheat the stomach, but a poorly built wall could crush a body. Stone did not forgive. The worksite itself carried risk. Scaffolding creaked under weight, ropes pulled at loads, and dust stuck to the sweat on workers' hands. A mason might stand high above the street, placing one stone after another while people passed below. Buckets of mortar, wooden frames, iron tools, and stacked blocks all depended on balance and attention. One slip could hurt the worker or the crowd beneath him. Poor workers carried the danger twice. They built the walls, hauled the stone, mixed the mortar, and lifted timber with aching backs and raw hands. Then they went home through the same streets where weak buildings could fall. A man who helped raise a structure might later pass beneath another one made by someone less careful. Skill protected everyone, not only the person paying for the work. That made reputation important. A builder known for poor work could lose trust quickly. People remembered cracked walls, leaking roofs, leaning corners, and repairs that failed too soon. Patrons did not want to pay twice, and towns did not want rubble in the streets. If a building collapsed, blame could fall heavily because the damage was visible, public, and sometimes deadly. A fallen wall made excuses useless. For ordinary families, a house was not just a shelter. It held bedding, tools, stored grain, cooking pots, clothing, and the few objects a poor household could not easily replace. If a roof failed or a wall gave way, the loss could be ruinous. A family might survive the collapse and still lose the things that kept them alive through winter. Bad building turned poverty into exposure. The fear was simple. By evening, a mason might clean his tools, scrape mortar from his hands, and leave the stones to settle in the fading light. The wall might look firm enough to anyone passing. A buyer might walk under it with fish wrapped in cloth, a child might touch the fresh mortar, and a neighbour might glance up at the new work without knowing what was hidden inside. Good work disappeared into safety. Bad work waited. A badly built wall was not just a craftsman's mistake, because one weak joint, loose stone, or careless repair could fall onto workers, children, buyers, and anyone passing below. But the same fear of bad work also shaped the rules of craft guilds, where young workers had to wait, train, obey, and prove themselves before selling goods under their own name. Poor tools in impatient hands could make a shoe split in the mud, a blade break in the grip, or one bad product damage trust across an entire trade. Guild rules could feel like a locked door to a young craft worker. A boy in a small workshop might spend years sweeping floors, carrying wood, holding tools, sharpening blades, sorting leather, or watching a master do the work he wanted to do himself. His hands might already be rough, his back already sore, and his patience already thin. Still, he was not yet allowed to stand as a full craftsman. He had to wait. The workshop could be cramped and loud from morning. A shoemaker's room might smell of leathers, wax, sweat, and damp thread, while a metal worker's space carried heat, smoke, filings, and the sharp sound of tools striking. So a young apprentice might eat bread with dirty fingers, sleep near the place he worked, and learn by repeating small tasks until his wrists ached. Skill came slowly. That slowness felt unfair. A young man who wanted money quickly could hate the rules. He might believe he was ready to sell shoes, knives, belts, barrels, or cloth long before the guild or master agreed. He could see customers in the market, coins changing hands, and older craftsmen earning respect while he remained under orders. The delay could feel like another form of poverty. Time was expensive. Guilds could control who entered a trade, how long someone trained, what quality goods had to meet, and who could sell under a recognized name. This was not always generous or fair. Guilds could protect skilled work, but they could also keep outsiders away, limit competition, and make advancement harder for poor people without the right connections. A closed trade could look like protection to one man and punishment to another. Both could be true. Still, the rules had a practical side. A bad shoe was not only ugly, it could split in the mud while a labourer walked to work, leaving his foot wet, cold, and sore for the rest of the day. A weak blade could snap in someone's hand. A poorly made barrel could leak ale, grain, or salted food that a poor household could not afford to lose. Bad work hurts buyers. A poor customer often could not replace a failed product. If a belt broke, a shoe tore, or a tool bent after a few days, the loss did not feel small. It meant more coins gone, more repairs, more walking in discomfort, or more work done with unsafe equipment. A wealthy buyer might return angry and buy better elsewhere. A poor buyer had to live with the failure, so that made quality serious. If you enjoy these quiet stories about the strange rules that shaped ordinary medieval life, you can like the video and subscribe so the next parts can continue through the darker corners of the past. The small objects in these stories mattered because people used them every day. A shoe, a knife, a strap, a pot, or a piece of cloth was not a decoration for the poor. It was survival equipment. A guild mark or an approved master's name could give some confidence. It told buyers that the object had passed through training, inspection, reputation, and responsibility. It did not make every product perfect, and it did not remove cheating from the world. But it gave the market something more stable than a stranger's promise. Trust needed a sign. Inside the workshop, that trust was built through repetition. An apprentice learned how leather stretched, how wood split, how metal cooled, how seams failed, and how customers noticed small defects. The master might inspect the work with hard eyes, turning it in his hands before deciding whether it was fit to sell. The young worker could feel shame when the product was rejected. That shame was training, but there was another side to it. A master could use rules to keep power too long. A guild could demand fees, family ties, proper approval, or years of waiting that kept talented poor workers stuck below full status. The same system that protected buyers could also protect established craftsmen from newcomers. Quality and control lived together in the same room. The apprentice knew that by evening, the workshop might smell of cooling, metal-cut wood, wet leather, or old smoke. The young worker might sit with sore fingers, looking at something he had made, but could not yet sell under his own name. He wanted recognition, but the trade demanded proof. In a world without modern schools, licenses, or factory standards, the workshop itself became the test. The rules could be bitter. A guild law not only protects tradition, it protected the buyer who needed a shoe to look through mud, a blade to hold under pressure, and a tool that would not fail in the middle of work. It also protected the reputation of everyone in the trade, because one careless craftsman could make customers distrust many honest ones. That is why the slow path mattered, even when it felt like a cage. Guild rules were not just old men blocking young workers, because bad training could leave poor buyers with shoes that split, tools that failed, and goods they could not afford to replace. But outside the workshop, another rule could feel even harsher, because a hungry person might be punished for taking food from a forest filled with animals. One poor man hiding a snare under wet leaves could be risking punishment not for sport, but for one small animal that might feed his family for a night. Forest law could feel cruelest when hunger was already inside the house. A poor man might walk near the edge of the woods before dawn, with wet leaves under his feet, a small knife hidden in his clothing, and the thought of his children waiting for something better than bread and thin broth. The forest could seem full of life. Birds moving in branches, rabbits under roots, deer prints pressed into soft ground. But much of that life did not belong to him. That was the bitterness. To a hungry family, a rabbit was not a sport. So it was meat in the pot, fat on the tongue, bones for broth, and one night when children might sleep with less pain in their stomachs. A deer was even near Morting, though far more dangerous to take, because it represented more food than many poor homes could hope to see at once. The forest looked like a relief, so law saw property. In many medieval places, hunting rights were tied to lordship, land control, noble privilege, and the management of game. This did not mean every forest rule was identical everywhere, or that every woodland was guarded in the same way. But in many areas, ordinary people could face serious punishment for taking animals that belonged, by law and power, to someone above them. The forest was not simply open land. It was controlled space. A poor man setting a rough snare under leaves might know exactly what he risked. His hands could shake from cold fear or hunger as he bent close to the ground, trying to hide the cord where an animal might pass. Every cracked twig could sound too loud. Every distant movement could feel like a forester coming through the trees. Fear made the woods smaller. The Lord's view was different. Deer, boar, hares, and other game could represent status, sport, food supply, authority, and control over land. Hunting was not only about eating, it was a sign of rank, a privilege that showed who commanded the forest and who merely lived near it. If anyone could take animals freely, the noble power over the woodland weakens. That was the logic. But logic did not make it fair. A family with no meat in the pot could not accept the idea of property rights. A mother scraping the bottom of a bowl could not feed her children with the dignity of noble hunting customs. A labourer, returning home with empty hands, might know that animals had moved through the trees all morning, close enough to see, but not legally close enough to touch. Hunger made the rule feel obscene. The forest could mock the poor. There were practical reasons for control beyond privilege. Overhunting could reduce game, damage resources, create disputes, and make land harder to manage. Lords and authorities wanted order in the woods, just as towns wanted order in markets, streets, ovens, and workshops. But those reasons sat uneasily beside the suffering of people who needed food immediately. A rule could have a reason and still feel brutal. The poor lived inside that contradiction. A caught poacher could face fines, humiliation, imprisonment, mutilation in harsher contexts, or other punishment depending on place, period, and authority. Even a lesser penalty could ruin a poor household. A fine might take money meant for grain. Time in custody could mean lost work. Public shame could mark a man as disnescent when hunger had pushed him into the trees. The punishment fed no one. The forest itself carried tension. Mist could hang between trunks, birds could scatter suddenly, and hoofprints could appear in mud like a promise. So man might crouch beside a snare with dirt under his nails, listening for dogs, voices, or the steps of a keeper. He might not think of rebellion, politics, or noble rights. He might think only of the pot at home. That made the crime simple and terrible. For the ruling class, poaching threatened order. For the poor, the law turned food into danger. A small animal caught in a trap could become evidence. A knife, a cord, a hidden carcass, or blood on a sleeve could speak against a hungry person before he had a chance to explain. In the forest, survival itself could leave marks. Those marks could condemn him. By evening, a poor household might still have only bread, onions, weak ale, or thin soup. The forest would remain nearby, darkening under the trees, full of animals protected by rules stronger than hunger. A child might ask whether there would be meat, and the answer could be silence. The law had kept the Lord's game safe. The family stayed hungry. Forest law was not just about animals, because it could turn a poor person's attempt to feed his family into a punishable crime in the eyes of those who controlled the land. But another rule could trap the poor even closer to home, forcing them to carry their grain to a lord's mill and pay for the right to turn it into flour. One sack of grain dragged through mud to the mill could return lighter, taxed, and less able to fill the bowls waiting at home. The mill could stand close enough to the village to be seen often, yet still feel like a place where poor people lost just part of what they had carried there. So a farmer or tenant might walk with a sack of grain across mud, frost, or wet grass, feeling the weight pull at his back before the day's work had even begun. Inside the sack was not luxury, not extra comfort, and not food to waste. It was the future flour of the household. Every handful mattered. Some manors and lordships, people were required to use the Lord's mill, instead of grinding their grain wherever they wished. They had to bring wheat, rye, barley, or oats to the appointed place and pay a fee for the grinding. To the peasant carrying the sack, this could feel like another hand reaching into his food before his family had eaten. The rule had a reason in the system, but the burden was real. The mill was not a small machine. It could be expensive to build, repair, and maintain, especially when it depended on water, wheels, stones, timber, iron parts, and skilled labour. From the Lord's side, the mill was property, investment, control, and income. It turned grain into flour, but it also turned dependence into payment. That was the power of it. So a poor household might already owe rent, labour, dues, and other obligations. The grain in the sack had come from long in fields, sore hands, bad weather, and worry over harvest. A woman at home might be waiting to mix flour with water, stretch it into bread, thicken broth, or save a little for later. So when the sack left the house, it carried hope with it. It did not always return whole. At the mill, people could wait in silence or low complaint. Sacks leaned against the walls, flour, dust whitened the floor, and the turning wheel made a steady sound that reminded everyone the Lord's system was moving. The miller knew the stones, the measures, the order of grinding, and the fee. The peasant knew only that some part would be taken. That made resentment easy. The miller himself might not be rich or cruel. He could be another working man, covered in flour, responsible for keeping stones moving, handling complaints, and answering to someone above him. To the person paying the fee, he was the face of the loss. His hands touched the grain before the family's bread existed. Trust was thin there. A peasant might worry about more than the official fee. Was the measure fair? Was too much flour being kept back? Was the grinding clean, or was good grain mixed with worse? Could the miller favour one person over another? In a world where poor people had little power, even a small suspicion could grow heavy. Flour showed the loss plainly. When the ground grain came home, it might be poured carefully into a bin, sack, or wooden container, so mother might look at the amount and already begin dividing it in her head. Some for bread, some for pottage, some saved if the weather turned bad, some stretched with poorer grain if needed. If there was less than expected, the whole week changed. The stomach did the counting. Its rule was not beautiful, and it should not be made to sound kind. It tied ordinary food to feudal control. A family could grow grain through its own labour and still be forced to pay for the right to make that grain usable. The mill made bread possible, but it also reminded peasants that even their daily meal passed through someone else's authority. That feeling could sour everything. Still, from inside the medieval system, the rule had its logic. A lord wanted people to use the mill that had been built and maintained on his land. Fees helped support the machinery, the estate, and the economic order that held the manor together. Controlling milling also helped control production, dues, and the movement of grain. It was practical for those who benefited. It hurt those who paid. A hidden hand mill at home might seem like an act of survival. Grinding secretly could save a little flour, a little fee, a little dignity. But if discovered, it could bring punishment, confiscation, or more trouble than the household could afford. The peasant was trapped between hunger and obedience. By evening the sack might return lighter, the path home muddier, and the worker more tired than before. So inside the house, flour dust could cling to fingers as the first dough was made. The bread might still feed the family, but everyone knew part of it had been lost before it reached the oven. The mill had taken its share. The Lord's mill was not just a place where grain became flour, because it could take food, fees, time, and dignity from people already living close to hunger. But another rule reached beyond bread and work into the soul of the village, where church attendance could show whether someone still belonged to the community. A person missing from the cold stone floor on a holy day could become more than absent, because neighbours might begin to wonder what was wrong with them. Church attendance in a medieval community was not only a private matter of belief. The bell called people from houses, yards, workshops, fields and market lanes into one shared place where everyone could see who came and who did not. A person stepping through the church door entered more than worship, because the same building held memory, habit, news, judgment, comfort and pressure. Faith had neighbours. Absence was visible. So a poor man might come in with mud still on his shoes and cold in his hands. A servant girl might stand near others in plain clothing, tired from work already done before the bell rang. So a widow might arrive with a worn cloak pulled close, knowing that church was one place where people still noticed whether she belonged among them. The stone floor was cold, but the eyes around it could feel colder. People measured one another quietly. In many medieval communities, attending church on holy days could be expected, required, or strongly enforced by custom and authority. This did not mean every person felt only oppression when they entered the church. For many, it was also a place of prayer, music, ritual, charity, meeting, and consolation in a life full of hunger, sickness, grief, and labour. But the same place that comforted people always watched them. That made it powerful. The church helped organise time. Bells marked hours, saints' days, fasts, feasts, funerals, marriages, baptisms, and seasons of work and rest. A poor household might not own written calendars or clocks, but it knew time through sound, ritual, and repetition. So when the bell rang for a holy day, the whole community heard it. Ignoring it was not easy. A closed door could speak. Someone who stayed away too often could become suspicious. Neighbours might wonder whether the person was sick, rebellious, ashamed, lazy, sinful, poor, beyond hiding, or simply unwilling to join the common rhythm. In a world where privacy was thin, repeated absence could become a story before the absent person explained it. People filled the silence with judgment. The pressure was social as much as religious. A family might hurry children into better clothing, brush dirt from a cloak, or tie a head covering properly before walking to church. So even poor clothing had to look as respectable as possible. A mother might worry that a torn sleeve or dirty hem would be noticed more than the prayer itself. Being present was one duty, looking acceptable while present was another. Respectability took work. For the poor, a holy day could bring mixed feelings. Going to church meant stopping labour, washing as best one could, dressing carefully, standing among neighbours, and losing time that might have been used for earning, mending, carrying, or cooking. But it could also mean a break from tools, fields, smoke, and commands. The same rule that limited personal choice could give the body a pause, so that contradiction mattered. The church was also where news travelled. People heard announcements, saw who was grieving, noticed who had new clothing, and learned who had quarrelled, married, given birth, or fallen into trouble. A person missing from that space did not simply miss a prayer. They missed the public map of the village. Over time, absence could make someone seem less connected. Belonging had a location. This should not be reduced to the idea that medieval religion was only control. That would flatten the lives of people who found meaning, fear, hope, beauty, and relief in ritual. A candle before an altar, a familiar chant, or a prayer for the dead could matter deeply to someone whose life offered few comforts. But belief did not remove pressure. The community stood around it. A person who wanted solitude could hardly disappear. The village knew who stood near, which pillar, who came late, who left quickly, who knelt with care, and who looked uncomfortable. The church gathered bodies and made them readable. In that sense, attendance showed not only devotion, but social position. The soul was not alone there. By the end of the service, people might step back into daylight, adjust cloaks, speak softly, and return towards smoke, mud, animals, and waiting chores. The poor would still be poor, the tired still tired, and the hungry still hungry. But for a short time, they had been placed inside the same rhythm as everyone else, so that rhythm could comfort, bind, and control all at once. Church attendance was not just about prayer in a medieval community, because showing up on holy days proved that a person still belonged inside the shared rhythm of neighbours, bells, judgment, and belief. But another holy rule could feel even stranger, because people might fret from talking when their hands needed wages, food, and repair more than rest. A labourer forced to put down his tools on a saint's day could gain one rare pause, yet still stare at an empty bowl and wonder how rest was supposed to feed his family. Holy days could stop a medieval worker's hands before the work was finished. A tool might be laid beside a bench, a plough left in the field, a basket set down half repaired, or a knife wiped and put away while there was still daylight to use. The bell called people toward church, rest, and public observance. But hunger did not always respect the calendar. A poor household could feel the pause immediately. Rest had a cost. A labourer who lived by daily work might look at a holy day with mixed feelings. His back could ache from carrying loads, digging earth, cutting wood, or standing in a workshop until his legs felt heavy. A day without labour might sound like mercies, especially when his hands were cracked, his shoes damp, and his body tired before sunrise. But no work could also mean no wage. That was the trouble. For a poor family, one day's lost earnings could matter. Bread still had to be bought, firewood still burned down, children still needed food, and rent or dues did not vanish because the church calendar had turned. A wife might count what remained in a pouch while the tools rested by the door. A child might enjoy the noise outside the church and still come home to a thin meal. The body rested, but the stomach did not. Holy days were not simply holidays in the modern sense. They mixed worship, community, rules, reputation, market activity, processions, feasting where possible, and social pressure. Some people may have welcomed them as moments of relief from hard labour. Others may have felt them as another command from a world already full of commands. Both could be true. A man might stand outside the church after service, rubbing rough fingers against his palms because they were not gripping a tool for once. So a woman might wear her better head covering and speak with neighbours. She rarely had time to meet during ordinary workdays. Children might watch stalls, small treats, or visiting traders if the holiday brought a fair or gathering. The pause could make life feel wider. For a moment, but the poor could not enjoy rest in the same way as the comfortable. A wealthier household might stop working and still eat well. A craftsman might close his shop without fearing the evening meal. A labouring family with little stored food could feel the day like a locked door. Rest was easier when tomorrow was already provided for. This is why the rule could feel unfair. It told people to stop, pray, attend, and join the rhythm of the community, even if their own survival depended on constant motion. A worker might look at an unfinished task and know it would still be waiting tomorrow. Saint's Day gave rest, but it also delayed the work that fed the household. The pause was not simple. Still, these restrictions had a reason in medieval life. The church calendar gave shape to the year, and holy days created shared time in a world without modern weekends. Say forced moments when bodies, tools, animals, and workshops could fall quieter. For people who work through mud, smoke, cold, hunger, and command, even an enforced pause could protect the body from being used without end. The rule could be a burden and a mercy, a field left untouched for a day, a hammer silent on the bench, or a loom standing still could show the power of religion over daily labour. But it could also show something else. Ordinary people were not machines, even if poverty often treated them that way. Hands needed rest, backs needed straightening, and tired eyes needed a day without staring at work. The calendar made that visible. Not everyone benefited equally. Some people still worked around the edges. Animals needed tending, food needed cooking, sick people needed care, and emergencies did not wait politely for holy observance to end. So a mother could not stop being a mother because day was sacred. A servant might still rise early, carry water, light fires, and prepare others for church. Rest often depended on who had the power to rest. The poor knew the difference. By evening, the tools might still lie where they had been placed, and the worker's hands might feel strange from not using them all day. There might have been prayer, talk, a little ale, a crowd outside the church, or a brief feeling of belonging. Then the family returned home, counted food, and prepared for work again. The holy day had passed, but poverty remained. A Saint's Day work ban was not only to control, because it could give worn bodies a rare pause while still making poor families fear the missing wage and the thinner meal. But after all these strange rules, the larger truth becomes harder to ignore. Medieval people were not foolish for fearing bread fraud, fire, filth, sickness, bad work, and social disorder. The final part will gather the whole street together, from the loaf on the scale to the coal in the hearth, and show why rules that sound bizarre today were often born from dangers that could ruin a life before nightfall. Many medieval rules sound strange only because the world around us has changed. A modern person can laugh at laws about weighing bread, checking ale, restraining pigs, cleaning gutters, covering fires, limiting clothing, or forcing grain through a lord's mill. From a distance, these rules can seem petty, harsh, controlling, or even absurd. But distance can make danger look smaller than it was. The past was closer to risk. So a loaf of bread was not just a loaf when a poor family had little else for supper. If it was too light, a mother cut thinner slices, a child finished eating too quickly, and a labourer left home with less strength in his body. A crooked scale did not need to steal much to matter. Suddenly, one missing handful repeated every market day became hunger in slow motion. Small loss counted. Eel, meat, fish, and grain carried the same pressure. A sour barrel could shame a brewer and cheat workers who paid for strength after labour. Spoiled fish could look like a cheap blessing before sickness came home in a basket. False weight could turn honest buying into quiet theft. The market was noisy, but much of its danger was hidden in ordinary exchange. People had reason to watch. Filth worked the same way. A dirty bucket thrown into the street did not stay one person's problem. It ran through gutters, stuck to shoes, drew flies, and entered homes on hems, soles, paws, and wheels. A loose pig could drag that mess through a market before anyone caught it. A block drain could make an entire row of houses live with one neighbour's neglect. The street was shared. Fire was even less forgiving. Coal left glowing at night, a careless oven, a brewing fire, or a lamp near dry material could destroy more than one household. In towns of timber, straw close walls, and narrow lanes, one mistake could become everyone's disaster. The evening bell and rules about fire were not only about obedience, they were about waking up alive. That fear was practical. Disease made people cruel because fear had few tools. A marked door, a closed house, a basket left outside, or a person with leprosy carrying a bell could show how much pain a community was willing to place on one body to protect the many. These rules could be harsh, lonely, and unjust. But they also came from a world where medicine often failed, and distance was one of the few defenses people understood. Survival had a hard edge. Work and craft were watched because bad work hurt real bodies. A weak wall could fall on a child walking below. A poor shoe could split in mud, leaving someone cold and injured. So a broken tool could ruin a day's labour. Rules for masons, guilds, materials and training could feel slow or unfair, but they were built around the fear that careless work could damage beyond the workshop. Quality was not abstract. Even the rules that feel most controlling had reasons inside their world. Clothing laws guarded rank and visible order, though they also trapped people inside their assigned place. Wedding limits could shrink joy, but they could also stop families from destroying themselves through public competition. Church attendance and holy day rest could pressure the soul, but they also gave rhythm to communities that had no modern weekend, no clock in every home, and few moments when labour truly stopped. Nothing was simple. Some laws protected the weak, some protected the powerful, some did both at once. Same rule could keep a poor buyer from being cheated, while another rule could force that same poor person to pay a lord's mill or go hungry beside a forest full of animals he was forbidden to touch. The medieval order was not our hind, but it was not random. The mistake is to imagine medieval people as foolish because their rules sound strange now. They lived with hunger closer to the table, fire closer to the roof, sickness closer to the bed, filth closer to the door, and authority closer to the body. Their world had fewer buffers. When something went wrong, the consequences arrived quickly. Changes how the rules look. A modern person sees a pig law and laughs. A medieval market seller saw a heavy animal knocking over food that had to feed a household. A modern person sees a bread rule and thinks of bureaucracy. So a poor buyer saw the difference between a full slice and a child still hungry after supper. A modern person hears curfew and thinks of control. A wooden town heard the bell and thought of fire. Fear gave shape to law. This does not mean the medieval world should be romanticized. Its many rules were harsh, unequal, and painful for those with the least power. A sick person could be isolated, a poor hunter punished, a servant judged by clothing, and a tenant forced to pay for the right to grind his own grain. Logic did not always mean justice. That matters. But these rules were rarely meaningless. They came from crowded streets, weak infrastructure, scarce food, expensive materials, hard labour, poor medicine, social pressure, and the constant need to keep daily life from breaking apart. A town had to protect bread, control waste, watch fire, manage trade, limit violence, and keep shared spaces usable. Without those efforts, life could become worse very quickly. The order was fragile. By night, the medieval town would quiet down. Doors closed, hearths dimmed, animals settled, and the last smells of smoke, mud, ale, bread, dung, and damp cloth lingered in the dark. Somewhere, a loaf rested on a table. A gutter still carried dirty water. A bell rope hung still, and a family slept under a roof they hoped would hold. Ordinary life had survived one more day. That was never guaranteed. These bizarre medieval rules were not proof that people in the past were stupid, because many of them were attempts to control hunger, fire, filth, sickness, cheating, violence, and collapse in a world with far fewer protections. They could be unfair, harsh, and painful, but they also show how fragile daily life was when one light loaf, one loose pig, one rotten fish, or one glowing coal could ruin everything before morning. So as this strange journey through medieval rules comes to an end, close your eyes, leave the muddy streets and crowded markets behind, and sleep well under a safer roof than many of them ever knew.